really needed to be rescued in the rest of chapter 1. And then we're going to see how it is that the Jewish people needed rescuing in chapter 2. Through most of the story of Western Christianity, there's been an extraordinary focus on our need of salvation, or redemption, if you like, or liberation, to use another word Paul has just used about good news, or rather, what good news implies. It doesn't matter what word we employ, and there are a significant number of metaphors in the New Testament for this reality. Salvation, liberation, redemption, whatever, something we need. We need, and we're powerless ourselves to actually bring it about. Often, our focus on this, though, I hope you might agree with me, has been extremely negative. And many people have actually become so frightened by this that they've been full of fear. They've been full of fear that, am I going to get into heaven? They've been afraid that they might lose their soul because they think that they're sinful, really sinful. Sometimes the language of Scripture doesn't really help us, especially when we can take things out of context. So just a little, I wanted to say that first. Then the theme talks about, what's this about, this whole letter? About God's righteousness. Now this has caused us some problems too. But ultimately it's a simple thing. God's righteousness is God's basic attitude towards us. We know that the people in the New Testament can be called righteous. What does that mean? If a person is righteous, they do what is lawful and just, and that person will surely live, says Ezekiel chapter 18. And the whole of the tradition of Jewish history says that the righteous person will always do the right thing by God and by their neighbour, but especially to the poor and the widow and the outcast. So when we say that God is righteous, as St. Paul will strongly say and believe, it means that God always does the right thing by his people, by us. God will always do what's the right thing by us. God can be trusted to do that, totally. But we discover this truth about God only through faith, which is ultimately welcoming God into our life. Not just what we have in our minds about God, but welcoming God into our hearts, our life. Then we understand that God is righteous. Even when we know that we're unworthy, we still have confidence in God's love towards us. God's on our side. Listen, Lord, to my prayer. Turn your ear to my appeal. You are faithful, you are just. Give answer. Do not call your servant to judgment, for no one is just in your sight. Psalm 143. So we're paddling around with this word righteousness. Our righteousness, God's righteousness. The last part of our presentation today is chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, and it's on God's wrath against the Jewish world. Now this is big stuff. We've got to truly understand this. So let's get into this. We come now to this section of human beings trying to live without faith or without God. This part of chapter 1 is looking at the Gentile world, how it's trying to live without God. Then we'll look at the Jewish world, what's happened to that. Paul is arguing here within a tradition that's Jewish, that's known by everybody. All Jewish people would have thought a bit like this about the Gentile world. For example, the Book of Wisdom says this: "Yes, naturally stupid are all people who have not known God, and who from the good things that are seen have not been able to discover He who is, or by studying the works have failed to recognize the Maker." Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, verse 1. Again, soon it is not enough that their knowledge of God should be at fault. With their child-murdering initiations, their secret mysteries, their orgies with outlandish ceremonies, they no longer retain any purity in their lives or their marriages. Saying that if we don't really hold God dear, it'll have an effect on the way our religious attitudes, and they'll be a bit occultish and off-beam, and it'll affect also our relationships, our marriages and so on. So that, from the Book of Wisdom, is a little bit of a sense of how Jewish people thought often of the mass of Gentile world. Of course, they were good people, of course, but often they were caught up in things that were not wholesome. So, both the author of this Book of Wisdom and St. Paul believe that with our God-given reason, we can come to some knowledge of God through the beautiful things God has made. But if we fail to do that, well then, in a sense, when we're at fault because we're not using our reason properly. And the inevitable result of failing to recognise God is immorality and social disharmony. When the fool says in his heart there is no God, then he or she falls into sinfulness. This biblical view goes back to how wonderfully we are made in God's image in the book of Genesis, and how bizarrely this was given up in the golden calf episode from the book of Exodus. And if I can quote Psalm 106 verse 20, "They made a calf at Horeb," Sinai, "performed prostrations to a smelted thing, exchanging the one who was their glory for the image of a grass-eating ox." That's extraordinary, isn't it? And that's behind it. When we've got a sense of God and God's glory, then we're made in God's image. We function well. When we don't have a sense of all that, well, then we turn to other images. And here, a grass-eating ox. So what St. Paul argues is that there is no righteousness so frequently on the human side. People are living really, in a sense, a lie in not recognising God, and they end up living irrationally, foolishly, wickedly. They make idols of birds and animals and reptiles, and fall prey to lustful desires and dishonourable practices. Verses 21 to 24. They serve the creature, not the Creator. They exchange truth for a lie, and therefore fall into unnatural sexual practices instead of following the natural order of creation. Verses 25 to 27. They tried God out and found the experience unsatisfactory. So they broke off all relationship with God, and so fell into social chaos and all manner of social vices. So it's a mentality, isn't it? We wouldn't hold it in the same way today. But of course, in the ancient pagan world, which was so religious, Therefore, prone